Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Te whaia te menata. Te mihi kia koe, menata. It is an extraordinary moment, I think, Mr. Speaker, when we have a descendant of the tribe, the Hapu, the iwi in question, being the Minister of the Crown who introduces the speech on this bill in its second reading. And the Minister may have missed it, but my halting Māori greeted her at the beginning of my speech, a short mihi just of acknowledgement of her role and some acknowledgement, I think, Mr. Speaker, of a Pākehā who tries to understand what this might mean, just what this might mean, that suddenly we're coming to the end of 100 and something years of struggle and protest on behalf of the Ngati people in order to reclaim some of the land that was theirs originally. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about a couple of things that I think are particularly significant in this settlement bill. And I would recommend that anybody who wants to know why this Parliament does these things reads the preamble to this bill. The history that is accounted or recounted in this bill, in the preamble, is worth more than just this House and the immediately affected iwi knowing about. It is the story of an Indigenous people who were trying to get on with those who arrived more recently, who were trying not only to get on with them, but to benefit from living together, from making sure that in this part of the country, which is largely around that Rangatike area, but includes a part of the country that runs between, if I remember correctly, the Whanganui and Whangaihu rivers. Being brought up in Taranaki, Mr. Speaker, I've had to learn from the Honourable Tariana Turia out of respect for where she comes from to pronounce the WH as a wh, and I acknowledge that. It's difficult to unlearn things. So to say Whangaihu when I've always driven across it and over it and around it and pronounced it Whangaihu is something that I will make an effort to do out of respect for those who come from there. And one of the amendments, Mr. Speaker, that I'm pleased to see that the Select Committee put in was that they insisted on putting the H into Whanganui, and they insisted, regardless of protests from outside, that should be the way it is spelt. And I acknowledge the work of the Select Committee, not only in that respect, but in the fact that with the submissions that they heard and the protests that were registered with them, they arrived at the conclusion that there wasn't much to amend in the bill as it was first put up. And I want to, in pledging Labour's support for this bill, which I hope has been obvious from my comments so far, to recognise some of the history and the length of time it has taken for this bill to get where it is. That in fact negotiations were led by the Honourable Dr. Michael Cullen, and the deed of settlement was signed on behalf of the Crown by the Honourable Parakura Horomia in October 2008. Its first introduction came in August 2009 and the first reading in November 2009. From there it was referred to the Māori Affairs Select Committee and finally has emerged today in its report back reading. So this area that we are talking about in this bill, Mr. Speaker, is that part of the Rangitikei, Manawatu area that anybody who is familiar with that country knows is beautiful, beautiful pastoral land and a beautiful part of the North Island. This story of purchase and quasi-agreement that started this process of alienation of land is one that I commend to people to read. Much of it, as I've said, Mr. Speaker, is recounted in the preamble, but it is worth noting that Ngati Apa never felt that they were properly consulted when an agreement was being drafted, and that they were never properly taken into account. And so, regardless of whether or not they received £1,000 in exchange for 86,200 acres of land, and whether or not that was fair, it is true at the time, but it is true that the reserve lands that were set aside for Ngati Apa were also alienated later. So it's hard to find a piece of Aotearoa New Zealand that hasn't been subjected to more laws, quite frankly. By the time one has gone through the events of the 1830s and the 1840s and on into the 1850s and the application of a number of laws to the settlement of this piece of land, it's a wonder that anybody can track exactly what went on, particularly as we're told that in some instances only the diary of the Pākehā negotiator was the record available. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer to some of the content of this bill. What it provides is a number of critical things which now people ought to be becoming familiar with as we move through treaty settlements. One is an acknowledgement of the obligations of the Crown. Another is an apology, because there are times when an apology is the only way that we can proceed as a nation to move forward. There has to be some recognition of wrongdoing and an apology even generations later. But beyond that, Mr. Speaker, the critical things also that lie in the bill are to do with the cultural redress and the commercial redress that are contained within this bill. The settlement includes an historical account, much of which I've alluded to in my speech, the Crown acknowledgement of historical breaches of the treaty, a Crown apology, a cultural redress package featuring the transfer of a number of sites of cultural significance to Ngati Apa, including 2 lake beds, and a quantum of money, including the opportunity to purchase 4 Crown properties in the Rangitikei region. I want also, in winding up, Mr. Speaker, to acknowledge some words that my colleague, the Honourable Mita Ririnui, said in his first speech on this bill at its first reading, and it echoes the statements of the Minister, which were the recognition of the young people who came forward to negotiate this settlement.
Sorry,
And I pay